This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the Australian cult classic television show Prisoner, also known as Prisoner Cell Block H. I'll be talking with Andrew Mercado, who's a TV historian, and the conversation will begin in a moment. In late 1979 in the United States, there were advertisements for a new television show from down under in Australia. It was women in prison. It promised to be sort of like 1940s Hollywood films of the same genre, and it was something that was highly anticipated in the U.S. and had a good couple of year run, but I never got to see the end of it because it was canceled where I lived in New York City at the time. This is a show called Prisoner, also known as Prisoner Cell Block H here in the U.S., and I'll be talking with TV historian Andrew Mercado about it. So welcome, Andrew. Before we get into the meat of what the show was about and the characters and all the great stuff there, can you give a little background, a minute or two, about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, I have been working and talking about TV now for about 25, 30 years. Spent the first decade of my life working in tourism, but I was always drawn to television, and eventually I got a job working on another soap that screened in America called Paradise Beach. I got a job as a location manager towards the end of that show, and then I had my foot in the door, and I was able to work there for a very long time afterwards. But I've always been particularly interested in Australian television history and nostalgia. We're not very good in Australia at keeping that sort of stuff alive. We don't repeat a lot of Australian shows. You know, networks here would rather buy a package of American repeats or British repeats and just put them on the TV station. So because there's always been that gap, I sort of stepped into it, and now with streaming, we're finally getting to see some of what we thought were lost TV series being found and coming back.
It's interesting. A few months ago, excuse me, I did a show on the rock group Zoot with Rick Springfield, and it's interesting, excuse me, because you could see clips into the early '70s that was still in black and white. And did color TV not come to Australia late?
Yeah, we didn't get colour TV till 1975, and the reason for that was because we were fighting the Vietnam War. The government of the time said, we have to make a decision here. We've got no money because we're helping America fight this war, and so colour TV. We were probably, I think, one of the, if not the last, then one of the last countries in the Western world to get colour TV. Yeah.
So, in looking up about the show, and we'll get to that in a second, I saw that there was actually a show in the mid-'70s, 74, 75, that was based upon a prison, women's prison, but it followed mostly the warders. Do you know what show I'm talking about?
Yeah, that was a British show called Within These Walls. And the reason we knew about in Australia was because Googie Withers, who played the governor of this prison, she was an Australian, well-known Australian stage and screen actress. So yeah, we were always very aware of that British TV show before Prisoner came along.
Also, the show was known as Prisoner in Australia and I guess several other countries, but it was called Prisoner Cell Block H here in the U.S. From what I've read, it was called Women in Prison in Canada. Was that because of the Patrick McGoohan show, The Prisoner?
Yeah, I think the Patrick McGoohan show had become a little bit of a cult hit, and I'm assuming from that it was being screened still and, was still a thing, whereas in Australia, I think we had played it through the 60s. We didn't have that same cultiness about the show, so Prisoner came and we never ever made the connotation. But I think because Canadian stations or American stations still had the Patrick McGoohan show and it was still screening around there, that's why they had to tack on that extra bit. Because it's funny, when you're watching Prisoner, nobody ever mentions Cell Block H, and then you suddenly get to this point in the show where suddenly every ward is like, oh, put them in Cell Block H. You're like, oh, right, okay, the title has kicked in.
So, it was a prime time soap opera in Australia, because in the U.S., It aired at late night. I think it was 11:30 p.m. Does Australia, or did Australia, have daytime soap operas? Because we had soap operas. I don't know if you've ever seen them in the Australia, like General Hospital, As the World Turns, that kind of thing. They were in the 70s 15, 30, and then finally a lot of them went to 60 minutes. But Prisoner started out as a nighttime soap, an hour-long soap. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we always watched those American soap operas here in Australia. Days of Our Lives and The Young and the Restless were huge. The Bold and the Beautiful is huge down here. But what we pioneered here in Australia was soap operas in prime time. We didn't make daytime soap operas. We were making primetime soap operas in the 70s. And once that format took off, it was you were either doing 5 half hours a week or you were doing 2 1-hour installments a week for TV. And Prisoner was originally designed to be a 16-part series, 16 episodes. And when they made those first 16 episodes, you know, they pretty much spent a week making each show. And then, of course, as the dailies came in and the networks saw it and went, no, hang on a second, we want this to be a new soap. When they doubled the workload effectively, I mean, that was when Carol Burns, who played Frankie Doyle, said, right, I'm out of here. I can't do what I'm doing here at twice the speed. So, yeah, we have always, or we used to, we don't do it today so much, but, you know, back through from the 70s on, most big Australian TV shows were being stripped in prime time, 5 nights a week for half an hour, or screening twice a week at 7:30 or 8:30 or 9:30.
But Prisoner was originally an hour-long soap, right?
Yeah, yeah. Once Prisoner started going, it would air, like it might air, say, on Tuesday and Wednesday nights at 8:30 or Tuesday and Thursday. They aired at different times in different capital cities before we went into a full network schedule and everyone watched at the same time. But, yeah, Aussies definitely watched 2 episodes a week in its original run.
The only American show I can think of that was like that twice a week was the original Batman show with Adam West, if you've ever seen that.
Yeah.
And that was only a half hour, and that sort of was making fun of the whole serial format. But did it have distinct seasons, as we call them in the U.S., or series, as I think? I mean, did it just go two a week, you know?
All year long.
Okay.
I mean, you know, our soaps just went all year round. You know, our TV year would begin at the end of our summer, which was the beginning of February, and then we would go right through to the end of November, and then summer TV for us was December, January. Christmas TV, nothing but repeats. But yeah, our soaps, we were churning it out, and I've always compared the production that we did of soaps in prime time, maybe a bit to America's Peyton Place, which was 2 half hours a week in the 60s, and at its peak was doing 3 half hours a week.
Oh, okay.
And the UK was doing something similar with Coronation Street in prime time, which were 2 half hours a week. But when Australia got into the soap game in 1972, by making a copy of Coronation Street called Number 96, they went, we're going to strip this 5 nights a week, Monday to Friday, and it was unheard of at the time, and they had to use one of the world's first computer to figure out how they were going to actually film it and do it. But once they started that, Aussie audiences almost kind of demanded it and expected it, and so that was Prisoner fitting into that mold.
So I mentioned earlier B films that Hollywood did in the 40s and 50s, women in prison and whatnot, and there was always sort of like a big Bertha character, the big butch lesbian that would bully everyone else and be what was called the top dog in Prisoner. But it seemed to me that the Prisoner at least was advertised initially in the U.S. You'd hear, you know, women in prison, violence, and you'd see something this, and it would go through, you know, several things, and then it was like lesbians. They were sort of playing off the Penthouse, Bob Guccione kind of thing here in the U.S. That was a famous porno magazine that, you know, somehow you would, but the thing is, whenever they did it, they initially showed like Karen Travers, who is Peter, was it Topano or Tapano? I don't know how you pronounce it.
It's Arno, yeah.
Yeah, and then Kerry Armstrong. So the beautiful blonde Catherine Deneuve wannabe, and Tapana, the beautiful. But they weren't the ones that were the lesbians. It was Carol Burns who played Frankie Doyle. And I've read, was she the first lesbian character worldwide that was at least a lead?
Well, yeah, maybe that's a good way of looking at it. We had certainly put lesbian characters into our primetime dramas in Number 96 and The Box on Australian TV before Prisoner. And Australia did actually have the first LGBT characters on TV. I've always referred to Frankie Doyle as being the first butch bull dyke on TV. And I mean, that what you described before, that cliche of the big butch dyke that would be in those prison films. I mean, that's the way that Frankie was presented, and the marketing, of course, lent into that. Because one thing we've been very good in terms of the primetime soaps that we've done, which we call soapies, by the way. One thing we're very good at doing is making them quite racy at the beginning, so that you can sort of sell it with this suggestion of sex. But the truth was that when you actually watch Prisoner, you could see that certainly in those first 16 episodes, they did some really heavy, hardcore research into actual female prisoner cases in Australia. And they did try to make that initial setup in Prisoner as realistic as possible and based on real life, which is not what a lot of soaps went to the trouble of doing.
Yeah, the thing that because Carol Burns was so good in the role, but she brought a vulnerability that said this is a human being first. She had a young brother who ends up getting killed after 2 or 3 appearances. She goes on the run with Colette Mann's Doreen, and I remember that her death was after, I guess, episode 20 or during episode 20 was something I do remember. And although it must have been later, because I think in the U.S. they were cut down to half-hour format, so it's probably 40 episodes in there. Yeah. But the characterization was so good in the setup. So I want to talk about some of the initial characters. To me, if we're talking the prisoners, the big 3 early on were Carol Burns's Frankie, Val Lehman's Queen Bee, and then I just loved Lizzie Birdsworth. To me, Lizzie Birdsworth was a Charles Dickens character. I mean, I remember, I guess it was in season 2 or 3, because I recently rewatched it a few months ago. There's when she's trying to get back into prison because she actually didn't kill anyone, and she's sent to prison though for a minor crime, and she goes to the judge, "You beauty," and the what was her name? Florence.
Sheila Florence.
Yeah, Sheila Florence. I mean, what a portrayal! And that initial trio was just so addictive to watch. What was your take on this trio?
Well, Frankie Doyle was the breakout star of the show. No one would have predicted that the bull dyke, bikey person who was in there for murder, by the way. Frankie was a murderer. But Carol Burns was very, very smart, and a lot of actresses turned down the role. And she said to the scriptwriters, they said, "Do you want to play the most hated woman in Australia?" And she said, "Only if you explain why she is the way she was." And that was that initial script writing that explained that, Frankie's anger came from a terrible childhood and a lot of trauma. And they did that so well. But by the time Frankie died, everyone was shedding a tear over that. So Carol Burns's performance and Frankie Doyle was absolutely the breakout star that no one saw coming. B. Smith, I always say that she was the best top dog. Val Lehman was an unknown on Australian TV. She'd come from theatre. Nobody knew who she was, so she was able to just step into that role and own it. And I mean, Sheila Florence had been around, but she'd only been playing bit roles in cop shows. She was in Bellbird. But the fact that you watch those first couple of episodes and Lizzie is very much a minor character that looks like she's just an old lag sitting in the corner. And the fact that, I mean, this is one of the great skills of these types of shows, is that you can have something on paper and say, this is what the show's going to be, and these are the characters that the show is going to be about. But then when you cast it and you see what those actors do with the lines, and then you see the chemistry, suddenly you go, oh, actually, no, those are going to be the breakout stars there. They're the ones that are really working, and you just sort of change things just a little bit because you've got to go with what's working, right?
Yeah, a similar dynamic happened in the U.S. when General Hospital had become, in the late 70s, early 80s, with, I don't know if you know, an actor named Anthony Geary, and
Yeah.
Luke was a rapist and a mobster who was retconned and reformed. And then they tried bringing on a main lead actor who also became very popular, Tristan Rogers, an Australian actor.
Yeah.
And so it's weird how that works. But yeah, Val Lehman's character I found very interesting too, because she starts out as a murderess, and then she kills two other people in the course of the show. She kills her ex-husband, and then she later kills a rival. And so technically she's a serial killer, but you understand her because of her involvement in the prison. She has a lot of this. She's against drugs, which I think was probably the thing. We have to make her moral in some way, so let's make her against drugs, which is like, if you ever saw The Godfather, mobsters who won't deal drugs, which is total bullshit here in the U.S. But it humanizes her, and I think one of the things that made both Frankie and B humanized was terrific soliloquies. I mean, some of the soliloquies they had in the first 2 or 3 seasons with the main characters were just really great writing. And I think one of the things, having watched all of the shows to the end, which I didn't have the chance initially, you lost that in the last 50%. But there were so many soliloquies that B had, that Frankie had, and some of the other characters had. Was the show awarded anything? I mean, is there the equivalent of the Emmy Awards here in the U.S.? Did it win awards for the acting and the writing? Because it should have.
Yeah, absolutely. Carol Burns won a Logie. Val Lehman won a Logie. I'm trying to remember if Sheila Florence actually won a Logie. So they are our versions of the Emmy Awards. And yes, Prisoner did win awards, and it was the critics mostly liked it. Some of them were couldn't see the appeal and never did see the appeal, but the show always rated well. But, in terms of the front half of the show and then the back half of the show, I, as someone who loves the show and was very much, part of that initial intake of prisoners, for me, when B. Smith left the show, episode 400, and then Lizzie Burdensworth leaves the show, and, straight away some of these major characters leave. Yeah, I think in the later part of the show, because they had this really successful formula for the first couple of years of the show, when those key actors left, they tried to replace those characters and have another cute little old lady. That didn't work. But, you can speak to some people that came in on the back half of the show and never saw those early years and think Prisoner's a great show, and are then able to go back and watch it all and be surprised at it. But, yeah, I think most people who started watching it in those original years, I think a lot of them fell off and maybe weren't there for watching every single episode to the end. Of
the top 4 or 5 female prisoner characters, to me the most underdeveloped was the Doreen character. She was this childlike character that walked around with a teddy bear. Then after Frankie died, she tried to assume the butch role for about 20 episodes. That was kind of ridiculous because she was not as good as Carol Burns, and it wasn't a believable switch. Then she sort of bounced back and forth with being against B, or she would be then revert to childishness. She left the show, then came back a couple of times. What was your take on that character? Because to me, that was the one character that never seemed to find the footing.
Well, I think that they had probably fairly or unfairly pegged Doreen as being used for comic relief.
Yeah.
And so then, of course, you have her flip-flopping between doing dramatic stuff where she gets pregnant, has a miscarriage, to then having to do something really silly and speak in that silly voice. So, yeah, they did certainly take Doreen. She got out of prison and then, committed a crime and got sent back in. She was on a work release for a long time, and she got married at one stage. She was on work release. Her life couldn't have been going better, and what happens? The hideous man she was working for in this factory targeted her and raped her, and everything went to hell again after that. So yeah, I think that they tried to what they tried to do with that character was always try to do two things with her. Use for the drama when they needed, but then use her for the comedy. And sometimes those things don't go as well together. But Colette Mann's performance was always magnificent for me.
Yeah, I think she did as best she could. To me, it was more the writing of the character that just was all over this place. Let me just talk about the two initial leads, the Kerry Armstrong character, Lynn Warner, and Peter Tapano's Karen Travers. They were obviously the eye candy to try to get men, I guess, to watch. And both of those characters, I think, were also sort of misfires. Kerry Armstrong's character was not, I mean, she wasn't as obviously juvenile as the Colette Mann character, but they did, other than, I mean, they had a few men she was involved with, and yes, I guess women do stupid things when men are around, but the character just seemed awfully dumb, and the Karen character too. In the first, I guess she was only on for a year and a half or so. They didn't seem to know where to go with her. Were they going to put her back with the Greg Miller, the doctor, or not? Was she going to toughen up? What was your take on those two characters? Because they seemed to be pushed as the initial leads, but then they quickly sort of became second tier.
Well, Lynn was meant to be that innocent country girl.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much that she was juvenile. She was just really naive because she wasn't a city girl like a lot of the other female prisoners. And Kerry Armstrong is such a fantastic actress, but, some of the stuff she'd done just before Prisoner, they were really kind of using her to highlight her sexiness, which is something that Prisoner didn't try to do. And then, of course, you did have the Karen Travers character played by Peter Tapano. The other thing you've got to remember about this is that this is a soapy. When Prisoner originally started, they had this beginning and end for 16 episodes, and they did have plans past that because the character of Frankie Doyle was based on the longest running female prisoner in New South Wales, who was a lesbian, who had murdered a taxi driver, who did get rehabilitated and then worked in a halfway house and helped prisoners. And that character of Frankie Doyle, who was based on that real life person, that was the role she was meant to have. She was meant to come good. Had Carol Burns stayed with the shows, Frankie Doyle was going to learn how to read and write, rehabilitate herself, and then become this person that would help prisoners. And instead, they had to take the Karen Travers character to do that and place her into that role because they wanted to have a halfway house and a place where they could continue stories outside of the prison. So that's the thing that happens with long-running soaps. When it's just going on and on forever, you sort of are making these decisions, I guess, on the run. And, if you make the wrong decision, it's easy to change it and send that character off somewhere else again.
Yeah, one of the early secondary characters was Amanda Muggleton's character. What was the name of the character again?
Chrissy Latham.
Right, Chrissy Latham. She's in the second or third episode. She murders the husband, and I'll talk about Elspeth Ballantyne's Meg in a moment. She murders him, but yet I think she's pretty much over the course of 250, 300 episodes that she appears in. She leaves a couple times, but each time she comes back, she seems to be a little bit wiser, a little bit more likable. And I think to me at least, she's an example of a character, unlike the Doreen character that just seemed to ping pong back and forth. There's steady growth in her character. Yeah,
that's true. I mean, another character that I would say has a bit of growth, even though sometimes it feels like she's doing the same thing over and over, and is Judy Bryant, who goes in there chasing this awful younger girlfriend of hers and then does end up becoming that very kind person in the prison that does help people and goes on all those crazy other adventures along the way. Yeah, it's long running, shows. Sometimes they get it right with that. But, in terms of them having that long-term vision, I think once they decided the prisoner would go twice a week, I think you can sit there in a room planning the first 16 episodes and go, it'll be this show, and if it goes longer, it'll be this. But once you say it's going to be a twice a week soap, and in the end it did. It ran for 5.5 years or something. So there's no end line inside at all. The only thing that we get right is we don't pull the pin and leave the stories hanging in midair. When they do decide, hey, the ratings are dropping too low, they gave them, I think, 8 weeks notice. So, okay, you can start wrapping things up and deliver a really fantastic final episode. But up until that point, nobody is thinking about the end of the show.
So let me talk about some of the characters who played the officers. And let me start with the first warden, the Erica Davidson character. I thought the warders were really well done. It's very easy to write the screws as nasty, but I thought Erica Davidson was very good. The doctor, Barry Quinn's character, was very good. And then the two that really stood out, and they were the two main ones, were Elspeth Ballantyne's Meg, who her husband gets killed. I think sometimes they, like when she remarried, the actor who played her second husband, to me, was just a stiff. I didn't think she had any chemistry. I couldn't believe that she would fall for him. And then the Vera Vinegar-Tits character. I mean, my God, what a great character. And you see early on, I mean, for me, of the long-term characters, putting Carol Burns aside, Sheila Florence, Val Lehman, and the Vera character, they just had such great dynamics as antagonists towards one another. And the thing is, having not seen the end of the series 40-some years ago, I did see a DVD once. I had a DVD of the top 20 episodes or something, which I did watch a decade or so ago. But hearing all the stuff about the Freak and Joan Ferguson, we'll talk about her, I so much preferred Vera's character because it was more based in reality. You could understand her motivations. They tried to do some of the same things with the Joan Ferguson character, with her father and the little boy that she takes care of. But I never bought the Freak as a character the way I did Vinegar-Tits.
Yeah, I mean, Vera Bennett, it was so identifiable. Once you saw that awful home life she had with the overbearing mother, and the fact that she'd never had a man, and she was never going to get a man with this awful overbearing mother. Yeah, your heart did break for Vera. And I mean, do you know how many teachers in Australia were being called Vinegar Tits by kids in the schoolyard when that show was on TV? Yeah, I mean, that it was very, very concerning at one point there, because Prisoner was a show that, crazily enough, obviously kids were really attracted to it. And you'll often hear Australian people of a certain age say, "Oh, Prisoner, my parents wouldn't let me watch that." And they say the same thing about in the 70s, Number 96 in the Box, or those shows. We were never allowed to watch them. But, if your parents say you're not allowed to watch something, it drives kids crazy. And Australian TV was very forthright and very bold. And we had nudity on TV in the 70s and queer characters and all these things going on. And Prisoner was fairly racy, but they weren't going as far as some of the soapies had done in the 70s before them. But it still had that vibe of, this is a show that little kids shouldn't be watching. But, of course, that just made kids want to watch it. So even in its first run, that show had a huge younger audience watching it. And my understanding of when it screened in America was that it screened in New York late at night and Philadelphia, but there were some places that they were screening it at 5:30 and 6 o'clock at night. And I can tell you, I'm horrified to think that Prisoner was screening in America at that time. Pretty much everywhere it's screened around the world and found a cult audience, it's been late at night. But yes, some markets in America, when they originally took it, were screening it around dinner time, and apparently there were complaints, and I get that.
Yeah, in New York, where I grew up, it was, I think they might have even had sometimes back-to-back episodes, half-hour episodes. It was 11 p.m., 11:30. But then they moved it to like 1:30, 2 p.m. in the morning, 2 a.m. in the morning. I couldn't, that's when I stopped watching it. I could, but the Meg character, though, Meg Jackson, Meg Morris, was a very difficult character, I would think, to act because she's the moral center of the show. I mean, it's not like she ever, like sometimes in American soaps, you'll have the goody goody character, and then they get bonked on the head and they become crazy, and then they get bonked again and they go back to being the normal character that you loved. But her character never really had that. Yeah, after her husband died, she was a little bit pissed at the Chrissy Latham character naturally. But other than that, she was very much the moral center of the show, and yet she did such a wonderful job. And I think they always showed her as willing to help. And did she ever win any awards? Because hers is, when you talk about Frankie or B, those are in a sense easier roles because they are the bad guys, and people always are interested. But the good guy is always a difficult role to do.
Yeah, that is so true. And no, she never got an award for that. And yet Elspeth Ballantyne was the only actress that was in the first episode of Prisoner and made it all the way through to the end. Meg Jackson was the only character who survived, and she is the most magnificent human being. And I remember once introducing her at an event and telling this story about her. A friend of mine was in Vietnam and sent me a message and said, I'm staying in an Airbnb, and there's an old Australian actor who runs this Airbnb, and he says his claim to fame is that he raped Meg Morris in Prisoner. Do you know who he is? And I went back to her and said, which time? Because I think she got raped 3 times in the series. And when I told this story, I just saw Elspeth Ballantyne throw her head back and laugh like it was, so she's a wonderful, wonderful person. And yeah, you're so true. The person that has to play the good guy, the slightly boring character that doesn't go on these crazy adventures, her performance was very solid, and she's in the show from the beginning to the end.
So, Andrew, what were the 2 or 3 early story arcs, other than the Frankie arc, that made this a hit initially?
The first year of that show, the thing I remember about the first year was what we used to have here is the summer cliffhangers. I personally think Dallas stole it off Australia myself. But yeah, I remember when the show began in 1979, and when it finished that first year, the big cliffhanger was Sigrid Thornton was trying to escape the prison, and she was with these terrorists, and they shot Erica Davidson. That was the big end of year, first year cliffhanger. And I guess the thing I remember the most about that first year is the fact that you had those core characters, those first 16 episodes, and then you saw Prisoner move into this next show where they started bringing in newer characters so that it wasn't relying on Doreen, Lizzie and Bea, and that's when you started getting Margot and all these other characters that started to come in. And I guess they started to think a lot more about the prison, and that yes, there would be different cells and you could be sent somewhere else, and there was Barnhurst Prison that you could be transferred to, and they kind of created this universe. And that's my memory of the first year of the show, what a great job they did bringing in those extra characters and really locking people in and making that show. That show for the first 3 years was a massive, massive ratings hit down here.
Yeah, Margot was a terrific character too, and her inbred clan of hillbillies, I guess we call them here in the U.S. But that does bring up the bad guys, and like I said, even though she was a triple murderess, B would been considered a good guy. When I think of the initial bad guys on the show, what year did Gerard Maguire's character come on?
Jim Fletcher, he would have come in, I think, that maybe at the end of the first year, and he was definitely there the second year.
And then they brought on his buddy from Vietnam, who was a total psychopath. One of 3 characters, all bad guys, played by the same actor. But the first one was quite memorable. Were the people who appeared as bad guys, did they become sort of cult favorites themselves? And was that character a favorite?
It's incredible that you mentioned that, because that you're talking about Ray Marr,
Yeah.
who did play 3 characters in it, and he did play that first character, and then he played the governor, I think, of Barnhurst.
Yeah.
For some reason, that to transfer all the prisoners there, and he was a bad governor.
And then he was also a mobster or something.
Yeah, and he did play bad guys, and yet Ray Marr ended up in an Aussie soap called Home and Away, which is still going to this day, and he plays Alf, who runs the fishing shop, and he has Expression, Struth, and Stone the Flamin' Crows, and he's the linchpin of that show, and he's now, I think, the longest running Australian actor to appear in the same role. So he plays the nicest, friendliest, least bad guy in the world now. So yeah, those early roles that you get. And you know, the record for the most number of roles that anyone played in Prisoner was Peter Flett. Peter Flett played 5 characters in Prisoner, and one of whom was like, you know, the heavenly father of something who was running a religious cult and always had smoke rising from the back of his wicker chair, you know. But he played 5 roles over those 5 years, and nobody seemed to notice.
Yeah. Then there was well, Gerard Maguire was, I guess, the first male officer. And I'm wondering, was that a controversy in real life in Australia? Did they? Because here in the U.S., for the longest time, as far as I know, they didn't have males interacting with female characters or female actual prisoners.
I don't remember there being a single problem about that at all. See, what's interesting about Prisoner is that, you know, it was meant to be this adults-only, harder show for a time slot. And then, of course, they decided it would go out twice a week. And straight away, they started, I think, toning down some of the storylines. And then when it was sold to America and became such a big success over there, that's when they toned it down even more. I mean, they'd done their original research. And something that came back that was undeniable about women's prison was that they were full of lesbians, and that they were not full of lesbians. There was a lot of lesbianism, and there was a lot of drugs. Yeah. And so the producers of Prisoner had to go, right, well, we can't do that show. So they make B. Smith anti-drugs because her daughter has died of a heroin overdose. So then you can bring the drugs in just sporadically. And the lesbianism in Prisoner was always meant to be there, and was there with Frankie Doyle, and was there when Judy arrived. Yeah. Then the Americans went, oh, look, yeah, but there can be lesbians in there, but we don't want them to be having relationships. So we went, oh, okay then. So we really toned it down. And then the Americans said, oh, after a couple of years, oh, we don't want the show anymore. So then it was like, oh, well, maybe we can go back there. And Jane Ferguson's a lesbian. Maybe she can have a girlfriend. So she kind of gets that storyline at the end of the show. So in terms of the tone and what they thought they could get away with, that did change a lot over the years, and all those factors were a part of that.
There were a lot of male, I mean, a lot of the bad guys were male. There was some female rivals for top dog, but there was the fellow, I forget the character's name, the Scotsman, who was a real...
Oh, yeah, Jock Stewart.
Yeah. Vinegar Tits had a mobster boyfriend early on, but while he was a bad guy, you didn't necessarily see him doing some of the bad stuff. He always hired out. Then, I guess midway through the run, they had the odd idea of bringing on 3 male characters and putting them in the same prison with the women, which to me, that was one of the most silly ideas. Yeah. And I guess the one quote-unquote good male criminal became involved with the second top dog who replaced B, whose name, again, it's been a few months since I watched it, and I'm not as familiar with the later characters. Was that just a rating stunt to bring on these male characters?
It wasn't a stunt, but I think it shows desperation in the scriptwriter's room. And I think that, I think you look at something like that and think, but that's ridiculous. No female prison would just allow these 3 male prisoners to walk around unsupervised, especially when one of them is a rapist and he does end up raping someone in the prison. It is ridiculous. And I think that's something that you see in year 4, for whatever it was, where you go, oh, yeah, this show's just because this is the thing, when you're churning out 2 hours a week, not only do you start repeating yourselves, but you do start going, what can we do? And I particularly think that the back end of Prisoner, that character that dressed like Boy George from the Culture Club, I just hated that because, first of all, it was like, well, that wouldn't be allowed under the dress code of a prisoner. And secondly, you're really dating the show by doing that, now going, the show is set in 1984, because one of the really interesting things that I think, and one of the reasons why I think Prisoner continues to be repeated all around the world today, is because shows where people wear uniforms don't date so much because they have that timeless quality.
Yeah.
So because most of Prisoner, except when, Vinegar Tits goes out for a night on the town and you're going, what are you wearing? What's this awful disco you're going to? Most of the time you see that they're in denim overalls, so you kind of lose track of, wait, is this show? Oh, yeah, I know this is an old show, but was it filmed in the 90s? You kind of lose track of that. But yeah, when you start having a character in there that's obsessed by Boy George and there's posters of Culture Club over your wall, that's when you go, the script writers are running out of ideas.
Yeah, and I think another thing that showed that the show was running out of gas, as we call it here. Do you call it petrol or gas in Australia?
Yeah, we'd say both, yeah.
Was initially the show had a really great sense of humor. Lizzie and Doreen were like you said, the originally background, funny characters. But also in the first season there was the Marilyn Mason character and her electrician boyfriend who just to rewire an on-off switch took him like 4 episodes because he was busy banging Marilyn. And that stuff was a good needed break, and it balanced the show from the more melodramatic Frankie arc or Bea and her rages about this or that rival for the top dog. By the time we get to the middle and the end of the show, almost all the humor seemed to be gone. There were still some good moments, but it thinned out. You still had some good characters here or there, but it thinned out. And then I think the show began to rely too much on the freak and whatever Joan Ferguson was going to do. Was she going to digitally rape another female prisoner or whatnot? And like I said, having seen it, I and it's not a knock against the actress. I think she did what was what she could with the character, but it got so repetitive with her. I mean, she was arguing with what was the second blonde character, Colleen?
Judith McGrath, Colleen.
Yeah.
Po-face.
Yeah. Right, Po-face, yeah. And there was the constant back and forth. What was your take overall when you initially saw it? And have you watched the show since? And does the Joan Ferguson character hold up for you or not?
Yeah, the Joan Ferguson character is so iconic. Because when Vera leaves the show, you kind of it goes, the show's missing something, and then you get Vera, a supercharged Vera, but 100 times more scary because she's the freak with the black leather gloves. So yeah, that was a shot in the arm, and she was there. There was that great rivalry between the freak and Bea and all of that, and it did really, really work for the show. And see, the thing about Australia is we don't really have sweeps weeks, so we don't really do stunts. The show's just going out all year. When they're thinking of a stunt, they're thinking of what's going to be the summer cliffhanger to keep people talking for 2 months over the year, and you're bringing in guest stars and all that through the year, but there's no particular time of the year where you're trying to do a stunt to get extra high ratings. And then the other thing that goes on is that no Australian soapie has ever gone, you know what, we're running out of ideas. I think we should wrap things up and go out on top. They never do. They all kind of are on this peak. They peak and then they're all sort of on this slow decline. And then eventually the ratings get so terrible, they go, pull the pin. Okay, we'll give you a little bit of time. Wrap it up nicely and give the fans something, which is something nice at least that we do here. But yeah, it's just, Prisoner just went for too long. And the network weren't planning, the network probably should have put pulled the pin a year before it came to an end and gone, yeah, well, let's get out now. And but that's not how Australian TV dramas have ever worked.
So you did mention just now that there was a sort of hiatus, a summer hiatus for Prisoner at some point for 2 months.
Yeah.
Okay. So at one final character to talk about before we talk about how they brought it to an end. When they replaced Erica Davidson as the warden, I guess. She was someone who was very seemingly by the book, but she had a kind heart. The second warden, the female warden, not the bad guy. There was several males who had the role, but I enjoyed her. I think she was good. They gave her breast cancer. Etc. But when they finally made the decision for the show to end, you said they gave them about 8 weeks to wrap things up. What famously, I guess the capturing of the freak was the climax of the last couple of episodes. But what other things were planned for the ending? Because I know with the freak character, I mean, we're not talking an Einstein here, but she's so dumb at the end and in getting caught because she had several times come within a whisker of getting busted for this or that, and then she ends up trusting one of the other characters, the Rita, who they fake the death of, which means that then Rita, who didn't like the authorities, was somehow working undercover to bust the freak. To me, it just seemed kind of weird and wasn't particularly believable, even if it was satisfying to see the freak get her comeuppance.
Yeah, look, I've never ever watched that last 6 months of Prisoner in any great detail. I have seen the final episode many times. I find it very satisfying because, of course, after how many episodes we had seen the freak getting away with so much, it was great for her to be caught and then have that last scene. So it was a great ending in that sense. I don't think they were really concerned too much about the other characters. I think you're exactly right. The show had turned into the Joan Ferguson show, and actress Maggie Kirkpatrick will say to you that she will talk about how difficult those last few months were on the show and talk about the fact that they had run out of storylines for Joan Ferguson and that she had said to her agent, I got to get out of here. They suggested the other day that maybe I should get a boyfriend. Are you kidding me? We can't suddenly decide that the show's resident lesbian is going to go out with a man because he's looked at her once. So they were really scraping for ideas towards the end there. So, yeah, I think you've absolutely nailed it. The last end of that show, apart from the Rita character, the Rita character was probably the last great top dog that they got right. They had a lot of terrible top dogs in between after Myra was killed in the siege, and then, all these people became top dogs. A lot of them were very hit and miss, but they struck gold with Rita, and I think it was right that they made Rita the person that brought Joan down at the end, because by that stage, those were the strongest characters in the show.
Yeah, there was mobsters, terrorists, cultists that broke into the prison. It's like this was one of the worst guarded prisons in human history. But so let's talk about the legacy of the show. It seems to me, having watched some of the characters appear at events, and where they do an hour's talk about the show 20, 30, 40 years later. Is the show regarded as sort of a touchstone of Australian culture, television culture?
Yeah, I think it would. Look, there's always a bit of an attitude here in Australia, they were just soaps, that's not a big deal. But I think, the soaps we made in the 70s, like Number 96 in the Box, was so raunchy with nudity, and the things were so adult, they couldn't be screened anywhere outside of Australia. We were the only country brave enough to do that. And then in the 80s, that format became Neighbours and Home and Away, and those soaps became hugely popular in the UK, and suddenly there was this market for our shows. And then, of course, we tried to shove some into America along the way, and it never really worked. the thing that's worked with Prisoner has really been the stroke of genius with Prisoner has been the fact that they programmed it late at night. They developed a cult audience with those late night screenings. It's also was one of the very few Australian soaps that has been repeated and repeated more than once. You know, here in Australia, the show's screened. Then they repeated it here in Australia at 11 p.m. at night, 5 nights a week, you know, a few years later. So there was a new audience there. And then, of course, they did that again. And I think even to this day, you could go on to the network that originally screened Prisoner. If you go on to their free website, streaming site here in Australia, there'll be a Prisoner channel there screening it 24/7, and those first maybe 100 episodes. I think the show is remembered really well. I think it's also remembered because it's one of the very few TV shows in Australia and indeed at the world at the time that had a predominantly female cast. And to think that a show like that succeeded, where the women weren't glamorous. You know, most shows where there'd be a lot of women, you would expect them to be in sexy nurses' uniforms and stuff like that. But it wasn't like that. The women didn't wear makeup. They were in, you know, it was a show where the women weren't glamorized, where there were a whole bunch of female actresses in Australia that got to be in Prisoner. Just about, you know, the majority of Australia's actresses at that time were in it at one point or another. So I think that was is a bit of a badge of honour for us. And I also think, too, because it was a complicated subject, because it was about prison and no one had ever really done a show like that. And even though I think, especially at the end, Prisoner was not realistic at all, but it did make people think about it. And, you know, when they originally made the show, they said, you know, the basis of this show will be that everyone is in their own prison in some way or another because of their personal problems. And, you know, so people were able to sort of watch this. I don't know that they really identified with it, but they were quite fascinated by it. And, yeah, it is highly thought of. It did lead to an incredible remake called Wentworth, where they did it as a prequel, but set it in modern time and took all of those original characters, but then they would twist something. So every time you were watching Prisoner going, I know where this is going, I've seen this before in Prisoner, oh, we're going in the other direction completely. So, yeah, they brought on that. And Prisoner was remade around the world. They made a version in Germany. I think they did a version in Sweden. So it is a real touchstone. And in the UK, they had 3 theatres, stage shows of it. 2 straight dramas where Australian actresses would fly over, reprise their roles with British actors doing some of those early characters. And then they did this crazy pantomime musical of it, where, you know, Joan Ferguson walked around the stage, you know, with whips and the audience would hiss at her. So, yeah, in terms of being a pop culture phenomenon, yeah, Prisoner did tick a lot of those boxes.
Let me just ask about the political culture of the time 40 years ago and now in Australia. Here in the U.S., the early 1980s, well, the whole 1980s was considered the golden age of soaps, daytime soaps in the U.S., as well as nighttime, I guess. You know, I mentioned the characters of Luke and Laura in General Hospital, which was a huge thing here in the U.S., a cultural touchstone. But there you see more nudity in the 80s. Not full nudity, but partial nudity. You would have more sexually bold things. They did develop some habits where they'd have every bad girl would end up getting raped and becoming a good girl character. And this led to the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, here in the U.S., eventually getting rid of the Luke character and other characters because they didn't want to promote rape. Here, for example, you couldn't you can't say the word abortion, or I mean, I guess you could say it, but they say terminate a pregnancy. Where is Australia? Do people look back at the original Prisoner and say, oh, they were so barbaric then, or is it? You mentioned Wentworth. Is it still racy for its day here? Because the U.S. is sort of getting more Victorian. Where is Australia?
Yeah. Well, look, Wentworth is considered a pretty, it's a cable show. It's allowed to be hard because it's on cable and it's not on a network TV show. Prisoner isn't thought of as being that racy because we had been so much racier just before that with a show called Number 96 in 1972 and The Box in 1974. These are the shows I talked about that couldn't be screened outside of Australia. These were 5-night-a-week soaps that were adult shows that were incredibly popular. They were the number 1 and number 2 highest rating shows of the year in 1974. And, in the dying months of number 96, they had full frontal TV, full frontal nudity on free-to-air network TV at 8:30 at night. And I'm not talking a little bit of my towel slipped for a flash. We're talking a character who stood there, a woman who stood there and had conversations with people completely full frontal nude at 8:30 at night. So if anybody's talking about how racy Australian TV used to be, they talk about that. And Prisoner is almost seen as, Prisoner, oh God, Prisoner was fine, in comparison to that. So even though those people forget how tough those first episodes were with Prisoner and how that show was trying very hard to be a drama, because everybody remembers those happy years of Prisoner where there was drama, but there was Bea and Doreen and Lizzie, and they'd make a joke about vinegar tits and they'd all laugh, and it kind of looked like, and the show did have a lot of comedy in some of those and a lot of lighter moments to balance out the drama. So yeah, it's not really thought of as being this show that kind of broke barriers and stuff like that, because the other shows had done that first, but it is remembered really, really well.
One point I do want to ask about, since I'm ignorant of the social situation in Australia, is towards the end of Prisoner, I noticed that there was an Aboriginal character who was a prisoner, and then there was, I guess, her parole officer who is also Aboriginal. Here in the U.S., it's taken a long time for black African American people and actors and characters to get. It's not even proportional yet, but it's closer than it was. When you mentioned a show like Wentworth, was that better at racial representation in Australia? And are Aboriginals in Australia, have they suffered to the same degree as, say, black Americans have here? That you could, whatever.
Yeah. The plight of Indigenous Australians is still really terrible to this day here. But I guess the question you're asking me is, yes, sometimes the representations of them on TV isn't great, and sometimes it's very just doing lip service. But this really fantastic thing happened in Australia probably about 20 years ago, where we have we have public broadcasting, we have the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Network, and they actually created an Indigenous unit. And they actually got Jimmy McGovern, who the English writer, Scottish writer, I think, who wrote the show Cracker. He came over and worked with Indigenous writers and helped them how to make TV. And out of that, they made a TV series called Redfern Now. And that's kind of seen as the beginning of what is now an incredible wave of Indigenous filmmakers, and this is happening in cinema and it's happening in TV, and it's fantastic. Now we have like a franchise called Mystery Road, where Aaron Peterson plays an Aboriginal detective, and it's become a TV series, and it's become a prequel TV series now with Mark Cole-Smith playing the same character beforehand, and it's kind of created this original genre for Australian TV, because we've never really done westerns. We don't have the wild old west, but we do have the outback. And so now when you've got these First Nations stories with Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander script writers and actors, they have this thing now that they call, I think it's outback noir. That's the expression that they come up, and there's this certain look. I think that there's a look here because of the light in Australia. So yeah, we have come a really long way in the last 20 years. And if the truth is that if you were going to make a show like Prisoner, if you were looking at that today, you would say, yes, there will be lesbianism. Yes, there will be a lot of drugs in prison. And most 50% of that, there will be an overwhelming per capita, per head of population of Aboriginals locked up in custody. And that was why when they did Wentworth, they made the character of Doreen. She became that character to represent that. I think that we're a lot better at representing that now, but I also think it's great that we now actually let Indigenous people tell their own stories as well.
Well, I mentioned a couple of actors and performers, Rick Springfield, Tristan Rogers, who are Australian, who went on to name success in American films. Margot Robbie, I think, is another one who would put that. Was any of the original actors or actresses on Prisoner, did they go on to greater success? You mentioned that the fellow who played the three characters became a beloved soap on another soap character. But did any of them reach that level of a Rick Springfield or a Robbie?
I mentioned Sigrid Thornton before, being in that first, playing Rosalind in that first end of year cliffhanger. Look, she went on to make an incredibly successful Australian film, The Man from Snowy River. She made a series for CBS. I think it was called Paradise. She started, it was a Western. She starred along Lee Horsley. She did a show where All the Rivers Run, which was a huge hit on HBO when it screened in America. She's definitely become a real icon of Australian cinema and TV. And there were certain actors that did that. But, I guess Margot Robbie is someone we look at, and we talk now a lot about the stars that have come out of the current soaps, Neighbours and Home and Away. Chris Hemsworth and Isla Fisher and Margot Robbie. And, the story I heard about Margot Robbie was that she finished in Neighbours on the Friday. She flew to America and she was cast in her first TV series, Pan Am, on the Monday, because Hollywood figured out that if you'd been starring in an Australian primetime soap for a couple of years and you landed in Hollywood, you could act, because no one would keep you in a show for 2 years if you couldn't keep up with that pace and all of that. So, yeah, I think Margot Robbie is the latest example of someone. And, Neighbours is coming to an end, and it's a very it's a terrifying prospect now, because we don't make anywhere near the amount of Australian drama that we used to do. And here is Neighbours about to stop filming, and it'll wrap up at the end of the year, and you just think, wow, that's just... who else is making TV every week of the year? Where do we find the actors of tomorrow and the new directors and the people that become interns? And Neighbours was a show where you could start watching Neighbours when you're in high school, write a letter to the producers and go, I've got some ideas. The producers say, give us a call when you finish school. And that guy is now the executive producer of Neighbours 40 years later. I mean, where are those people going to come from without those long-running shows? We don't make shows that run 40 weeks of the year like Prisoner anymore. We're going to have one left called Home and Away. And I think the Australian government, I believe, needs to do something about, we've always had quotas here that networks, if they had a network license, they had a quota to make, a certain amount of kids' TV per year and a certain amount of drama. Or during the pandemic with COVID, they threw those rules out the window and said, oh, we'll get back and we'll think about that, because we really should include some international streaming companies now, and they're down here taking money off Australians, but they're not making a lot of Australian programs. So I think something like has to be worked out, and I think that us telling stories and you telling stories, every country should be telling their own stories, and that should be really important, and sometimes that needs government assistance and intervention.
Well, when I first started watching soap operas in the late 70s, 80s, American soap operas, they were about 16 or 17 a year, and we had 3 networks. Now with all this other entertainment, there's only 4 left. There seems to be, I think CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System here in the U.S., is starting a new soap, but it hasn't aired yet. It's mostly African American cast.
No, it's airing. I'm fascinated by Beyond the Gates. It's rating really well. And I'm fascinated by what the Americans are doing in this, because the Brits are in a bit of trouble with this. Their long-running hits, EastEnders and Coronation Street, that would be in the top 10 shows, are now rating around 80 or 90. They're in a real trough. And I look at what's happening in America and looking at the fact that Days of Our Lives is the second most important show on Peacock. I mean, there's Love Island's their highest rated show, and Days of Our Lives is their second highest rating show on Peacock. And guess what? Love Island's only on for a few weeks of the year, and Days of Our Lives is on all year. So it means people are coming back to your stream every day. And that's the power of soap. And the Americans have done that. The fact that CBS have even commissioned a soap, which I would have thought was unthinkable, considering how many of them have been axed in the last 20 years. America is doing something and getting something right in terms of the streaming audience and finding this new audience past broadcast TV. The Brits are kind of, I think, trying to figure it out. And here in Australia, I don't know where we're going to end up. It used to be one of the great things that we did, but we're going to end up with only one soap on air, and I don't know where the next one will come from.
You know, before we wrap up, and I have one final question about Prisoner, but let me just ask this before I do. I wonder if the reason that soap operas here in the U.S. have declined, and from what you're saying, worldwide are not what they were, is because of the death of episodic television. We used to have, if you watch Star Trek, Kirk and Spock would go to this. If you watched the Rockford Files, or if you watched Magnum P.I., each week there was a self-contained story. But what happened, it seems to me, in the last 20, 25 years with the rise of cable is everything has become almost serialized. You could have Dexter, you could have Breaking Bad, you could have Tony Soprano, and it's like, but that makes everything eventually a soap opera, because when you do serials, you have to interconnect, and you more easily fall back into lazy tropes and cliches. And I wonder if, because now everything seems to be a soap opera, that's why there aren't any real true soap operas.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. And I also think that a lot of reality shows are using soap tropes as well. I mean, you watch The Real Housewives of one of those things and it ends on a cliffhanger. It's like, I'm watching an episode of Beyond the Gates here. You know, this thing sometimes gets really hard to sell them apart. So, yeah, I think also, too, that when you do watch a kind of if there's a new original drama or something, it only goes for 8 episodes or 6 episodes or even 4 episodes, and it's all over. And you go, gosh, you know, if the audience is getting used to watching something and thinking that 4 episodes is a commitment, how are you going to ask them to watch a show that's 4 episodes every week? So, yeah, I don't know where it all ends up. But, look, the Americans are doing something right in this department at the moment, but this genre is cyclical, and, you know, let's see what happens next.
So my final question is for someone who hasn't watched the original Prisoner, all 692 episodes, or most of them. I have to admit, the last 150, 200 or so, you know, if a character I didn't like, I'd fast forward. But I know it's on. I know all 692 at least are online. Why should someone watch this? Why should someone watch a 40-plus-year-old show? What are they going to get from it?
I think what they'll get from it is, I think, you know, what I complain a lot about TV today is that everything I see is derivative of something I've seen before. And maybe that's because I'm getting old, and everything is a copy of something else being made for a new generation. But, you know, I think Prisoner is pretty original. I think that the family that they create within those Prisoner, and I think that those initial characters, I remember when they were remaking Wentworth, and I went to a scripting session with the people who were going to create Wentworth, and they said to me, they were basically saying to us all, there were a few of us there, what do you think are the key elements of Prisoner that have to be in Wentworth? And I remember one of the things I said to them was that one of the things I remember the most about Prisoner, and even when I watch the repeats, I see this, is that you have those core characters that are like family inside the prison. And at some point in the story, one of them gets paroled and they leave. And the thing is that if you've seen the show before, or there's often a pretty good chance that that person's going to reoffend and come back in. But when they have to say goodbye to each other and they're, you know, sobbing and like, oh, you know, don't come back, we don't want you to visit us, go out there in the world and all that, you know, that used to make me howl at the time when I saw it, that you would be breaking up, Bea and Doreen and Lizzie. You can't break them up. They're the three musketeers. So I think they did a really great job for what was a show that could have been a violent, quite nasty show. Somehow they created this show that was about a makeshift family. And I think that's one of the really unusual aspects, one of the surprise aspects of Prisoner, and one of the things that I think keeps a modern day audience watched. You fall in love with those characters, and then you're just with them no matter whether they do something good or whether they do something bad or whether they do something stupid. Those initial characters, you're on their side.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Andrew Mercado, thank you for spending an hour talking about this great old show.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed it.